Welcome to the Lifeability Podcast. Today we have Katerina Pavlakis and we talk all things about intuitive cooking. Katerina grew up in Greece in the 1970s with a Greek father and German mother. She inhabited a world where food cultures naturally mixed and merged. Home cooking wasn't a hobby or a special occasion thing. It was simply just how they lived. Even the local taverns felt like extensions of home kitchens. You could literally walk into their kitchens and peek into the pots to choose your meal. And so she never formally learned how to cook. The concept of cooking recipes didn't enter her world until her late 20s when she moved to London and encountered the cult of celebrity chefs and cookbook writers. And suddenly then she questioned whether she was really a good cook. Yet everyone who tasted her food raved about it. Katerina has seen too many passionate people lose their confidence to the pressures of modern food culture, the cult of recipes, glossy Instagram perfection, and celebrity chef culture. And that's how she realized that sharing her way of cooking could shine a light on the path towards more calm, fun taste in the kitchen. I hope you enjoyed today's session because this was truly an exploratory process of our senses and the process of cooking. Welcome, Katerina, to the Lifeability Podcast. I'm really excited to have you on here. As I was just mentioning to you before we hit record, intuition and cooking is something that I've often thought about, not only just servicing some of my clients, but also for myself, going through various phases in my life where I've been really, I guess, curious about the nutrition and what is, I guess, informed from external sources, and then what my body's sort of calling in. So I'm really excited to have you on here today.
I'm so glad to be here.
And I would love for us to, I guess, start off with maybe you sharing a little bit about your passion into this journey, and what is it about intuitive eating specifically?
Yeah, intuitive eating and intuitive cooking. So I think for a very long time I never thought much about it because I grew up in a family where cooking was an adventure. It wasn't a sort of like a high-end thing. Both of my parents were working, so it wasn't about fancy things, but it was about having fun with flavor from a very young age. And my mum was that kind of intuitive cook that was, just throwing in this and that in a pot. And so I grew up like this. So I don't remember learning to cook. I remember cooking my first meal all by myself for my family when I was 8. But I don't remember learning to cook, so I must have just soaked it up. And it didn't, and I thought, well, that's how it is. And, I grew up in Greece where home cooking was the thing, at least at the time in the 70s and 80s. And everybody was cooking at home. And even, if you went out to eat, if you went to a taverna, you'd be invited into the kitchen to choose your meal by looking into the pot. So everything was sort of very home kitchen like. And it wasn't until I moved to London in my 20s and I was sort of plonked into that sort of culture where recipes and chefs were, revered as the gods of the culinary doing right, that for a moment I lost my confidence because okay, if I can't follow a recipe, maybe then I'm not such a good cook after all, even though, anybody who would eat my food would love it. So so I think this idea of intuitive cooking being a thing, or even a useful thing, was maybe the seed was sown then, and it didn't really become a proper idea of me thinking, oh, maybe I can teach my way of cooking, until 10 years ago I started running a whole food shop in my, well, after London, I moved to a little town in Wales. So, and then we took over that whole food shop. And so for 10 years, I've been having conversations with people about food, and then inevitably about how to cook it, and recipes and ingredients, every day. And that's when I realized how much recipes are actually tripping up people, how recipes are actually killing our cooking skills, because we think that it's normal and necessary to follow some instructions that are given to us in a recipe, rather than follow that instinct that, making something good to eat, it is an instinct that humans have. This is not only survival, but also something very human. If you think about it, there are no other animals that cook. Animals do all sorts of amazing things, but cooking is a very human thing. And I'm convinced that we all have an instinct for what's good to eat. If nothing else, even if you haven't cooked anything your whole life, you have been eating probably 3 times a day your whole life. So you know what tastes good to you.
Yeah, wow. And it's so interesting how you said that when you were growing up, cooking was just part of the norm and you didn't really have to follow specific recipes. And I can so relate to that. Even now, when I'm sort of cooking, and often I'll be asked, oh, how much, what did you put in that? And it's like, I don't know. I just did, and how you were saying about your confidence was, I guess, questioned a little bit, or self-questioned, I should say. Yeah, there are definitely times, that I have wondered whether I should actually follow a certain kind of recipe, and I'm going to get the perfect result, or the outcome that. And I have to say that there are some things, for example, like a cheesecake, where I have found that if I just followed my intuition, I don't think I don't think it would turn out the way that I wanted to. But again, maybe that's a question, that I could explore. So you talked about interoception and, or intuition, and I would connect that back to interoception, being an occupational therapist. And my question is, if someone doesn't have a strong interoceptive sense, how do you go about that in terms of knowing what you should cook?
I think it's all about getting back into our senses, because our senses are what is hardwired into us as humans, seeking out food. So whether it's the taste, the smell, or even, the touch of something, looking at the color of something, and once you start cooking, also, the way something sizzles changes, for example. So all our senses can be involved in cooking, but we kind of have forgotten that, and we certainly have stopped practicing that because we expect the recipe to tell us exactly what to do. It's like, following your sat nav, and then you still don't know how you got there, whether if we make our way using our own senses, our own orientation, then we kind of remember how we got there. And of course, it's something that needs a bit of practice. You can't really learn cooking from reading or from watching cookery shows, which is what we all sort of seem to think. But there is also this sort of strange thing that the more we can become obsessed with cooking books and cookery shows and celebrity chefs, the less we actually cook at home. Maybe because we get so intimidated about doing it right or doing it wrong. And I think you're right about the cheesecake, that maybe certain, iconic dishes, certain kind of complicated dishes, certain things maybe need a certain technique, but you really don't need much technique to cook a tasty, nourishing dinner every day, and one that isn't the same meal every single day either. So it takes a lot less methodical knowledge than we think. Every cookery course starts with knife skills. You don't need to be a ninja, knife skills kind of ninja in order to cut an onion and cook it to get a base for your curry. Cut it any which way, it's fine. Yes, there are maybe finer details, and if you cut it smaller, it will disperse more and it will cook quicker and all of that. I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect, but I'm saying if you just want to cook a tasty, nourishing dinner, you don't need all this pizzazz, really.
So, how would you guide someone through an intuitive cooking session? What is your process?
So, when I sort of thought, I'd really would like to teach people, I had to sit down and actually think, well, what is it what I'm doing when I'm cooking? Because it may look like I'm throwing in the pan this and that, but it's not random. It's guided by something. So I sat down and thought about this, and I realized that what I'm doing, I'm thinking in layers. So I'm thinking of a base layer and a body layer and a top layer, like, the anatomy of a meal. And the base layer is very often, the onions. This is why the vast majority of recipes start with chop an onion. And a lot of different cultures have this sort of onion with celery, onion with carrot, onion with spices as a base. And that's not because you want your meal to taste of onions. That's because that gives you this sort of background depth of flavor. And then you have the sort of the main body of the dish where you put in everything else. And then you have the top layer, which is not the garnish. It's the layer where you start tweaking the flavor and playing with the flavor and adding maybe some complement or some contrast in texture or flavor to make it all come alive. And then I thought about this a bit more, and I thought, yeah, flavor also works in layers, because interesting, yummy, delicious flavor is complex. When it's sort of boring and bland and a bit meh, it's because it's one-dimensional. And so the more we think of flavor as, as a picture with a background and a main motif and shadows and lights sort of playing over the top, if we start thinking of flavor as the base and the body and the top, the layers again, where we paint a picture with complementing and contrasting, then we can make anything delicious. And I find it so oft with people who come and learn with me that the biggest problem seems to be, I can't decide what to cook. But once they learn to pay attention to the flavor, which is nothing else as, trusting your taste buds and maybe understanding that concept of layers and how to create complexity and contrast, then the problem of what to cook isn't so pressing anymore, because if you know that whatever you cook, it's going to be delicious, the what doesn't matter so much anymore. You can cook with whatever is in your fridge and with a few, ingredients you've got in your pantry that can make your flavor exciting. So, and the more I teach it, the more I see that understanding this concept of layers really does change the way people cook. It just simplifies everything, because it's giving you a lot of freedom, but it gives you enough of guidance not to feel completely lost. Because obviously, if you haven't been doing this automatically, and there is quite a lot of people out there, we probably all know someone who has this magic touch in the kitchen, throwing some things together, and it's always nice and tasty, out of nothing apparently. So if you use this simple concept of layers as your guide, the more you practice, you will soon, some people just, have light bulbs going off after just one session where we cook together.
So what I'm hearing is layers and flavors.
Yes.
Understanding the concept of layers, but also flavors is really important. And the flavors, I would assume, build on top of each other. So like the onions would give something to something else, and then whatever ingredients you're putting to the onions, that will give another flavor. And as you're going through this process, then are you so I'm just trying to practically imagine this happening. Are you going into your senses just naturally, and I guess your taste buds, and saying what would complement whatever smell or taste in my mouth that's happening right now, and make it even more vivid? Is that sort of what's happening?
Yeah, and I think the two directions is either the complement or the contrast.
Right.
So, for example, one of my favorite examples is to think of, like pumpkin soup, squash soup, and pumpkin has this sweetish kind of characteristic of flavor already. So other ingredients that bring this out, that complement that, like carrots or sweet potatoes or coconut milk or cream, that makes that sweetness come alive. So that is really nice ingredients to add to pumpkin soup. But then if you have sweet on sweet on sweet, that's a bit one-dimensional. So then you also want contrast, like ginger, like chili, like nutmeg, like a drizzle of lemon, a garnish of pickles. And if you actually now, with that knowledge, go and look at recipes of pumpkin soup, you will see that a lot of recipes, most recipes, are using these two devices of the complement and the contrast. And if they don't, you probably end up with a bit of a boring pumpkin soup. So, and obviously, there is an awful lot of boring recipes out there, because they all try to please everyone. And we all have really a different sense of taste and what we like and what we don't like. So if you try to please everyone, you're just totally middle of the road. Of course, there are exceptions, and there are amazing recipe writers out there that are different. But, these days with the internet, there is just, millions, billions of recipes out there. And they all try to stay middle of the road. And even if you follow a recipe, I mean, why not? I mean, I don't have anything against recipes. Recipes are amazing for inspiration. But who said that you can't taste as you're cooking after the recipe and then decide that you're going to add something more, or add something different, or add a bit more lemon or a bit more salt, because your taste buds tell you that's oh, that needs something. And if you can't quite work out what it needs, I would encourage anyone to think in that concept of, does it need strengthening of the sweetness or the savoriness, or does it need contrast to that? So, and this is actually a really simple concept that does wonders to how tasty your cooking ends up.
And so going back to my first question about interoception and, if someone doesn't have that strong sense, what would your recommendations be in terms of, starting to build that? Are they, just playing around with the food? So, for example, are they touching the texture and seeing how that feels? Are they looking at the vibrancy or the different colors and seeing, what that happens to their instincts, or the smell? Or because sometimes a lot of things might smell really bad or might taste really bad, as a when I say bad, I just like off-putting. But when you actually cook it, it's delicious, especially when you mix it with a few different things. So how would you help someone around that?
Well, as you said already, I think noticing is the most important skill, like paying attention. This is why cooking is also such a wonderful exercise in presence. So paying attention to what's in front of you, rather than looking at the recipe, look at your pot, at your ingredients. And, yes, playing around, but you don't have to make big, daring, dangerous experiments. Cook something you very familiar with, that one pasta dish you like making. And then maybe change one little thing and notice what happens. What happens if I add more salt, or if I add a squeeze of lemon, or if I add a splash of cream? What happens when you change one little thing? And I think this is, start from the familiar and then start working yourself up. And even if you're not cooking, like, even if it's a takeaway, what if you put a handful of herbs on your takeaway? What if you add a spoonful of yogurt to your curry? What does that do to the taste? So I think this is how I would recommend to get started, to notice what is in front of you, then change one little thing, start where you are and see what happens, and approach cooking with this curiosity. And I think when we're curious and we start, as you said again, playing around, and then it becomes sort of a bit less serious and a bit more playful. And this is when cooking becomes fun, cooking becomes enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. And I guess just with your example of a takeaway, one could also just be present and notice what they actually like in that, like what sort of flavors are jumping out at them. And they might, someone who hasn't been cooking might not exactly know what the ingredients are, but they could potentially still taste what the sweetness or the sourness or the bitterness, and then go from there, isn't it?
Well, exactly. And I think when I mean flavor, I also mean, you can break down flavor to these basic, flavor directions, the sour and the salty and the bitter. And as you say, you don't need to know what it is necessarily. You can learn that later as you go along.
Moving on to the other side of the spectrum, where we love cooking something and it's so flavorsome, but we know that it's not nutritional or healthy enough for our bodies. What do we do there? How do we change that?
What would be just to be sure we're on the same page, what would be an example in your mind that is home cooked, but it's not very good for you?
If I just go to the plain simple thing, like let's say we really like pasta, right? And we're having pasta 5 days a week. Um, Pasta being lots of carbs, right? I know having something like that 5 days a week is not really healthy for my body.
Yeah, okay, good. Great example. So I think we can keep the flavors we love and then tweak the nourishment. So we can either, add things to the pasta that make it more nourishing, because, pasta is carbs, but if we add vegetables, if we add protein, if we add fiber, then yes, we're still eating pasta, but at least it's a nourishing, pasta with a jar of tomato sauce that is shop bought and full of sugar is one thing, and pasta where you have added lots of other nourishing things to it is another thing. Okay, you're still eating the pasta, but then you can play around with the pasta. I mean, when I started sort of realizing that my blood sugar was all over the place, I sort of realized that about 5 years ago. Maybe it was also, the sort of period of life and perimenopause and all this. And I realized, gosh, I'm on this blood sugar roller coaster. So I really started looking at the carbs I was eating. So then I discovered, the legume pasta, which is like pasta, but it's made with lentil flour or bean flour or chickpea flour. So already it kind of tastes like pasta, but it does different things to your body. And then I discovered things like cabbage carbonara. So, you can use other things, vegetables, your favorite pasta sauce with cabbage or with broccoli, or, you can sort of use the flavors you love and tweak them so that it becomes more nourishing.
And I love that, going back to whole foods, you can start off with doing what you really love, even though it might not be the healthiest form. But once you've formed that habit, then actually starting to unpack what are the whole foods, and how can I actually make this sort of a flavor with something like that. So I love that concept.
Yeah, and I think in the end, it all comes down to whole foods, because yes, if you have certain health conditions, maybe you need more tweaking, and, paying attention to variety is always a good thing. But in my book, the problem starts with factory made foods. That's what the real problem is. So if you cook at home and use whole foods, I would, if in my book, if you cooked it, it's healthy, kind of, if you can avoid the factory made stuff and cook instead, that is the first step. Yes, you can start then making it even more nourishing after you made that step. But the first step really is, and I did start training as a nutritionist, and I kind of gave up halfway because I thought, I don't really want to be that person who doles out meal plans to people who are then only going to stick to it for a few weeks because the cooking is just taking up too much of it's too much effort. So I thought, no, actually, with my experience with talking to people in my shop, the if you can get over the hurdle of cooking for yourself every day, you're already halfway there. And then tweaking, once you get into the habit of cooking, tweaking things becomes really easy because you are more confident to say, yeah, I could try, eggs and bacon with cabbage, cabbage carbonara. You'd be surprised how tasty it is.
And I guess in the modern day world that we live in, with having such busy lives, um, it is about prioritizing just a little bit of time to do that cooking, isn't it?
And, this is such a good point, because I think that this sense that we don't have time for cooking is a big problem. And I think it's stopping a lot of people from cooking. And for this, I think I have two thoughts about that. One is that thinking about cooking and making it a big thing that you have to plan, that you have to find the recipe, then that you have to follow the recipe, and then you get anxious about the ingredients missing. So that whole brain space takes up so much more effort than the actual half an hour it's taking to make a simple meal. So this is why intuitive cooking is so helpful, learning to improvise with what you have. So you don't, if you love making meal plans and following them, fine. But if making meal plans is just driving you mad because you don't know what you want to eat on Thursday when it's Sunday, or maybe when it comes to Thursday, the cabbage you were planning to cook has gone bad or whatever, So if you can be flexible, it takes up so much less of a mental space. Thinking about cooking takes up more effort than the actual cooking. I'm convinced of that. And the other thing is this idea, and I think this culture of convenience has been trying for decades to convince us that, cooking is the obstacle to eating. So we better get cooking out of the way, preferably with all these shiny products that are being offered to us, so that, we can get cooking out of the way, so that we can get dinner out of the way, so that we can get on with our evening. But, what if our evening is the cooking and the eating? What cooking together and sharing a meal together is where, we come together with our partner, our children, our family, our friends. Sharing food is another, such a wonderful and such a human aspect of eating. Food is not just about gulping something down or even nourishing ourselves. Food is also about this shared experience of eating together. And I think if we stop trying to rush through cooking and therefore through eating, and just make that the experience, then suddenly there is more time for it.
Yeah, I love that. I actually love that. Actually making it an activity that is part of your day to day, like going to work, like going to the gym, like watching TV, but actually, spending that mindful, I guess, space doing it, right? So yeah, I love that concept. Rather than saying, oh, conveniently, like what's the easiest thing to do right now? I don't feel like cooking. I don't have the energy, but like, hey, hang on, how can we actually just do this together? Or even if, you're on your own, what can you actually do to make it easier and enjoyable, right? Like that's the main part of it.
And again, we have this whole idea that it has to be complicated, it has to be chefy, or otherwise it's not very good. I get that all the time. Well, I just cooked something simple. That doesn't really count. But how does it not count? How is it, not a proper meal to have, fried eggs with vegetables? That is a perfectly nourishing meal, say. you know so this idea that simple food is not really cooking. I don't know where it's come from. I think it's come from this idea that, to cook properly, you have to be cooking like a chef, which is another weird thing of our modern food culture, where our role models have become chefs, not our grandmother. And, nothing against chefs, but cooking in a restaurant for like paying customers is like a completely different thing than cooking at home for our loved ones and for ourselves. So trying to be like a chef doesn't make you a better cook. It's just two different things, cooking in a restaurant and cooking at home. So
Yeah.
I really think we should give ourselves credit that, cooking something nourishing is good enough.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because there will be so many times that you will go to a restaurant and it will look beautiful, it will be so aesthetically pleasing. But when you actually start digging into the food itself, the flavors aren't what your body is expecting from what you're seeing, right? And so if we can use that as an example for our bodies and for our minds to realize, hey, hang on, it doesn't need to be this amazingly dished out meal that really looks so good to the eye, but it's so shallow in its flavors. And again, what you said about the simplicity of meals, just reinforcing that that is still a meal. Your body is getting the nutrition that it needs, and it doesn't need to be this big fancy 3-course meal, or whatever, I guess, the nutritional world or the external world tells us that this is actually a proper meal, and this isn't, right? So yeah, I really love that. I could keep talking about this concept, because there are so many things that I would love to pull apart. I'm just going to finish off with one concept that I'd like to explore with you. For things that are not healthy for us, so things that we're addicted to, per se, what is your recommendation in breaking that change, breaking that cycle and actually changing that to something more nutritional for us?
I'm under the impression that, I'm not a specialist in food addiction, but I don't know anybody who overeats on whole foods.
Mm.
Like, I mean, you can't eat too many apples. Like, it's impossible. So what is addictive, what we get addicted to, is the processed stuff. I mean, I know that from myself. I don't have a sweet tooth, so I'm immune to chocolate. But, give me crisps or chips, and yeah, I know I can't stop. So I don't have that stuff in the house, for example. and I think, and the problem with that processed food is two problems. One is that the flavors have been literally engineered to be addictive. And it's just empty food. So your body thinks that it's getting something amazingly nutritious because it's so tasty, because that's the way it has been engineered. But it's empty food. Therefore, you then crave more and more and more, because, well, where's my nutrition, says your body. So I think rather than trying to deny ourselves that stuff, I think it makes more sense to focus on eating the good stuff. So, eat as many whole foods as you can, have as many good home cooked meals as you can that are satisfying. If you're really enjoying particular flavors, think creatively about how you can recreate that at home. And, including that, tomato sauce, for example, can be quite acidic because tomatoes are acidic. So a lot of the kind of commercial tomato sauce is full of sugar. So if you just put half a teaspoon of sugar in the tomato sauce you make at home, it might just taste more like the stuff you really, are used to. But half a teaspoon of sugar in a whole pot of sauce that, 4 people will share is very little sugar, nothing compared to the, several spoonfuls that you'll get in a pot of commercial sauce. So I think if we don't think in this sort of absolute terms, like, sugar is terrible for you, and we think like, if we just focus on putting as much whole food nutrition in our meals as we can and make it as tasty and enjoyable as possible, the more of the good stuff we eat, the less we will crave the stuff that isn't so good for us.
The other side to that is also like what you said, that your body is so used to a certain flavor. And so, sometimes it's also accepting that, but also then exploring. So, for example, instead of using sugar, let's try honey. And you will see naturally, after many episodes of using honey instead of sugar, that actually this tastes normal to me now. And when I actually have sugar, that tastes off, right? So it's understanding that cycle also, where we get used to certain things, but that doesn't mean that's how it's supposed to be. I guess just going back on some of the concepts around sticking to whole foods. So give you an example. Someone loves Macca's. They say it's really easy to get McDonald's, but sorry. It's cheap and I can get it whenever I want it. Don't have to do anything. And I love it. Why should I change? Like, this is so good. How would you help them shift?
Well, I think nobody can really shift unless they want to. So, I mean, I can tell them as much as I want that, that's bad for you. That's not really food. And if they don't see that somewhere themselves, I don't think, you have to want to change. Otherwise, but if you want to change, so your problem is not that you can see that maybe this isn't the best for you, but it is so easy and so tasty. So what you do, I mean, it's not that difficult to recreate hamburgers at home, really. Buying ground meat and adding some spices and making a patty and then eating that with bread isn't really that difficult. So, and you can then experiment with how you want to, mix the spices in your patty, which is probably going to end up a much tastier patty than you get at McDonald's or anywhere else. You can start experimenting with the type of bread you're using. So maybe you can have, bread that is not quite as white and puffy as, the buns you get in a fast food restaurant. And start having fun. Maybe you can just start having fun with recreating the best tasting, burger at home, and start with that. And I think, as in your example with the honey, if you do this a few times, you will actually realize that it's much tastier what you're making than what is out there. You just have to, obviously, to want to make that change. But you don't have to never again eat burgers. It's about I knew someone who was coming to my lessons. They had this sort of family tradition that at every family member's birthday, they would have a breakfast at McDonald's. If you go and have a McDonald's meal 3 times a year at each family member's breakfast, that's not going to kill you. It's fine. It's just eating it 5 days a week is the problem. So, if you're eating McDonald's 5 days a week, I would say, well, what if you cook at home one day? And then maybe it could be 2 days. And, if you're already having takeaway only once a week, well, maybe you can skip a week in a month, and then maybe you can skip 2 weeks. So I think taking it step by step rather than trying to change everything, because if you try to change everything, it's going to be so exhausting to stick to it that you're going to fall off the train 4 weeks later. And that is one of the problems, I think, with many of those nutrition plans. When someone has been to see a nutritionist and comes into my shop with a long list of ingredients they probably never cooked with in their lives, I can see that from the mile off. And, they have their plan. They've been to the nutritionist. I'm not going to, tell them that it's probably not going to work. But I can see that this is all too much change all at once. And it's just, 4 weeks later, it's becoming too not sustainable. So I think it's much better to start one step at a time and, just cook once a week, cook twice a week, make yourself a really good, make yourself a really good breakfast. I think that the evidence is agreeing more and more that, if you're going to change one meal, change your breakfast.
Yeah, and I can completely relate to that also, having been through that path. And I remember sticking to a meal plan for a little bit, and then it just felt so overwhelming. It's like it just went down the gutter, really. And so I love your concept of, small steps, just one thing, just pick one thing and stick with it for a little bit, and then add something else. So yeah, I love it. Well, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, Katerina. I want to finish off with 3 questions that I love asking my guest speakers. The first one being, how do you see the future of holistic health and well-being?
I would love to see more people discovering and trusting how much they already know about their own health, their own body, and their own skills of keeping themselves healthy. I think if we just slow down enough so that we notice, we can find that we actually know so much already without waiting for some external authority to tell us what to do.
And so just trusting that intuition and following through with that.
Yes, which requires first to, allow the space and the quietness to actually hear what that intuition wants to say. But I think we've gotten used too much to just listen to what we're told and not listen to ourselves enough.
Love it. Second question being, what is your favorite occupation? Occupation being any activity that you enjoy doing.
Well, I mean, I do enjoy cooking. I'm not a fancy cook at all. I like cooking simple, tasty stuff. And if that's too obvious, I think my other favorite thing is just enjoying the company of animals.
Yeah. Awesome. Last one being, what 3 resources can you recommend for someone who's wanting to start this intuitive cooking journey?
I think one would be to focus on flavor, on thinking about how to make things tasty, so that it becomes less important what you're gonna cook. Just focus on learning how to make things tasty. The second thing would be to, when you look at recipes, try to take a step back and see the pattern behind recipes, because then you'll see that, the 3 billion recipes of tomato sauce are all versions of each other. The 3 billion recipes of curry are all versions of each other. And once you can see the concept rather than the recipe, it becomes much easier for you to improvise within that concept. Yes, you're making tomato sauce, but you can make small changes yourself. Yes, you're making a curry, but it doesn't really matter whether you're going to add cumin or coriander. So I think when you start looking at the concept rather than the recipe, it becomes much easier, sort of try to see the big picture. And the third one would be to, well, get your pots dirty. You really can't learn how to do it unless you do it. And, you can always taste it and tweak it until it's right.
I love it. Practice makes perfect, right?
Yes. And it's not about perfect. It's just about feeling
Perfect in your eye. I should
yeah,
say.
it's really about, it's really about the confidence that you can do it. And if it doesn't taste quite right, you know what to do to make it taste right. And it doesn't have to be perfect, It's really difficult to make something inedible. Yes, maybe it's not perfect, but it's still going to be quite okay. So, don't be afraid of breaking it, because it's actually, cooking is more forgiving than we've been told it is.
Amazing. And if people want to find out a little bit about you, what you do, where is the best place to find you?
Yeah, I think the best place is my website. That's theintuitivecook.co.uk. And I'm also on Instagram as The Intuitive Cook.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Do you have any final words?
Oh gosh, I feel that we had such a sort of wide-ranging and deep-going conversation already. So I don't know. My final word maybe is my favorite phrase. It's not rocket science. It's just dinner.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Katerina.
Thank you, Strada. That was a really great conversation. Thanks for having me.
So give me a second, because if I disconnect, I will come back here.
Okay.
Yep, you're here. That's fine. It's really weird.
It's still recording, apparently.
Is it recording? It doesn't say recording from my end.
It does say recording on my end.
Okay, hang on. Well, this is where your journey of exploration continues. Please subscribe to the Lifeability podcast so that you can stay tuned when new episodes come online. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. The mission at Lifeability is to inspire you to create a more fulfilling life for yourself and improve your quality of life. So why not share this podcast with your loved ones and create a ripple effect together? Until next time, Asante Sana.